In this video, I'm going to have Dungeons & Dragons take on Tunnels and Trolls. Let's see who wins. This isn't going to be an exhaustive comparison, and it's going to be pretty subjective. So there are lots of people that love Dungeons & Dragons, myself included, and there's lots of people that love Tunnels and Trolls, myself included. I like lots of systems. I've claimed this is my favorite game. I've claimed Rollmaster, but they're all my favorite games. I love these things. So anyway, I'm going to compare these. So, Dungeons & Dragons uses a D20 system we're all familiar with. You roll a D20, you compare it to armor class. Tunnels and Troll uses a D6 dice pool system, so there's no D20s at all involved in it. And so another aspect that's kind of interesting is that monsters are individualized in Dungeons & Dragons, the Moldvay Basic. So this one was published in 1974, and this one was published in 1975. So a year later. So this came out before this one. This one came out a year later. So just physical comparison right off the bat. This book is a little bit thinner. This book's a little bit thicker. However, this one also has an additional book that adds a whole bunch of other stuff to it, which I'm not going to include in this comparison. So, I'm just comparing these two books against each other. Is that fair? I don't know. Let me know. Leave a comment. I'm sure plenty of people will leave comments after this one. Okay, so as I said, this uses a D6 dice pool system. This uses the D20. In this one, monsters are very individualized and given robust descriptions, which is something I really appreciate. Lots of nice monster stats on them, lots of descriptions, lots of detail there. Tunnels and Trolls, not really so much. It's more, this is about what you get. You're supposed to make up the monsters yourself. You're supposed to, and then the monsters are rated according to level. Gives them a monster rating that tells you how many D6 dice they're going to use. Whereas in Dungeons & Dragons, you've got hit dice, right? And that tells you basically how tough they're going to be. Tells you how many hit points they're going to have. In Tunnels and Trolls, you have the monster rating, and then you have the number of dice plus a bonus. So if your monster rating is, let's say, 30, so you'd use 4 dice and you'd get a bonus of plus 15 to the dice roll. So you'd roll 4 dice, and I even have 4 dice sitting here. How handy is that? I wasn't playing that. And you'd add 15 to that, and that would be your roll. So what I mean by individuation is that in combat, this is more wargame-ish. This is more theater of the mind, if you like. So this one, I think, is more compatible with minis and stuff. This one, less so. One of the reasons for that is that in Tunnels and Trolls, you kind of put all the monsters together and you group their dice. So you can end up rolling a whole big handful of dice. And the players each get to roll individually, but the GM rolls for all the monsters all at once, and then any damage given is distributed amongst everyone involved. As opposed to this one, which has player versus monsters. Players dictate which monsters they want to attack, and it's more monster versus monster. This is more group versus group, if that makes any sense. So in Dungeons & Dragons, the Moldvay version, but all of them basically, the weapons do dice of damage, right? So the amount of damage that a weapon is going to do is dependent on the kind of weapon that you're using. Whereas in Tunnels and Trolls, you get a number of dice, and that's added to your attack roll. So one weapon might use 3d6, one might use 4d6, one might use 5d6, etc. And then your character that you're playing gets to add those to their roll, and then you compare the rolls, and whoever rolls the highest wins, and the other side takes that damage. And armor itself reduces the amount of damage that you can take. So it absorbs damage. That's how the armor works here. In D&D, it doesn't do that. In D&D, you get an armor class, and you have to roll. You have to roll the dice under the armor class, right? So here, where's a good example of that? Right here. So as you can see, you've got your armor class. You have to roll under it. In this one, armor absorbs damage, and the number of dice you get is your attack, and then you get bonuses and stuff for that. So the other thing, too, is that in Dungeons & Dragons, you have hit points. In Tunnels and Troll, you have a constitution. And monsters have a monster rating. And one thing I really like about Tunnels and Trolls, as you start to kill the monster rating goes down. And when the monster rating goes down to 0, you've killed the monster. But that means the combat, if you're starting to win against the monster, the combat's going to get easier and easier, right? As opposed to, and the monster's going to become weaker. As opposed to D&D, right up to the monster taking the last hit point of damage, that monster's just as tough as it was day one. So that's a little bit of a difference. In D&D, the combat tends to be a little bit slower. And Tunnels and Trolls, it's quite quick. Because you're not doing individual, you're not moving minis around. This game, they state quite clearly that it's not intended to be played with minis. It's more theater of the mind. This one, because it was born out of a war game, I feel like it, even though it does say theater of the mind and whatever is okay, but I think it's more made for minis. And so you're supposed to move minis around. So it's a lot more detailed, takes a lot more time to play out the combats in this game than it does in Tunnels and Trolls. So the other thing about both systems is that they're kind of OSR-like in that they're really not balanced. It doesn't... if you're out in the wilderness or you're in a dungeon and you meet a monster that seems too tough for you or too tough for your group, you should run. And you should run. In both instances, both games are like that. It's not like a modern game. Neither one is like a modern game where where there's an expectation that the DM is going to take it easy on you because you're not that high level, or they're gonna try and make the encounters compatible with your level so that you'll always win, right? This doesn't have a you'll always win attitude at all. Expect to lose. Tunnels and Trolls is actually, I think, a lot more brutal in that way than even Dungeons and Dragons is. So one thing interesting is that Dungeons & Dragons has halflings, whereas Tunnels and Trolls, this version of it at any rate, has hobbits in it. I think that's really interesting. Now, I know TSR got in trouble for having hobbits in their game. I don't know why they wouldn't get the license for it, but for some reason they didn't. And the license you would think would have been pretty cheap back then. I mean, today obviously it's not, but back then it would have been. This is before even the Lord of the Rings movie came out. So I don't know why they didn't. I don't know if Tunnels and Trolls did or not. But in Tunnels and Trolls anyway, you can play a full-on hobbit as opposed to having to play a halfling, which is, a hobbit. But shh, don't tell anybody for legal reasons. I don't know if the modern Tunnels and Trolls game does that. I don't have the modern Tunnels and Trolls game. So I'm only talking about this one. All right. So also, Tunnels and Trolls has fairies and leprechauns, which is pretty awesome. Whereas in Dungeons, and it also has the standard, the humans also. And this has dwarves and elves. This has dwarves and elves. But this also includes hobbits, fairies, and leprechauns, which I think is pretty neat. The other thing I really like about Tunnels and Trolls is that it is very good for solo play. If you're a solo player, like you like to play role-playing games solo, Tunnels and Trolls, hands down, in my opinion, has Dungeons and Dragons beat, because it puts all the monsters together. You're not expected to play everything out. You just group it, and it's basically dicing it out. Whereas this is a little more complicated. You're going to have minis, or you're going to have some sort of representation, or you're going to have some kind of map in your mind of who versus who and who's attacking where. That isn't required. So in terms of for solo play, Tunnels and Trolls hands down, has Dungeons and Dragons beat. Also, Tunnels and Trolls has a whole pile of modules that they used to have for solo play. And I think they still do. I mean, Tunnels and Trolls is still around. They're still going. So if you want to check it out, just go to Drive-Thru and you can see it. So one thing is Dungeons and Dragons in here, as I said before, has a lot more detail on the monsters than Tunnels and Trolls does. We have these great, glorious write-ups on them. However, Tunnels and Trolls encourages you and gives you the rules and explanations how to create your own monsters. I really like that. I think that captures the spirit of role-playing. This is hard for me to say. A little better than this does, right? How can I say that? Well, because this actually didn't. This is not the first version of D&D. The original version of D&D, the boxed edition, came out, and it was. Well, anyway, that's a whole can of worms. Leave a comment. Give me hell. But that's what I think about it. I'm not going to declare a winner in this versus. I'm only going to compare the two systems as I see them. And you can leave comments and decide for yourself which one has won. I'm not going to declare a winner. I'm not willing to go there. I'd be eviscerated in the comments. I know it. Okay. So both generate characters using 3 6-sided dice in a row. So none of this none of this wimpy roll 4, take away the lowest, that's your score. Nah, this one's very specific. You're not supposed to do that. This one, this one just says roll 3 dice in a row, that's your score. You're stuck with it. But Tunnels and Trolls, it's fun. Every time you level, you have a chance to actually increase your scores. So there's hope for a hopeless character in Tunnels and Trolls. Not so much in D&D. If you roll a hopeless character in D&D, you're going to have to try and find magic items. You're going to have to try and hide behind somebody a little tougher than you. That sort of thing. But this one, you can actually increase your stats. In Dungeons and Dragons, magic is like woo-woo. So it's just a force that's out there, and some people learn how to manipulate it, some don't, that sort of thing. In Tunnels and Troll, it's considered sort of a psionics, if you like, is the explanation for magic in it, which does kind of change things a little bit. So in Dungeons and Dragons, you memorize spells. Your character can memorize so many spells per day. In Tunnels and Trolls, you learn spells and then you can just cast them, but casting spells has a cost according to your level. So if you're level 5 and you cast a level 4 spell, it's going to cost you 1 strength point. And your strength is going to decrease 1 point. So basically it robs your body of strength to cast magic, whereas in D&D it doesn't. But you're more limited to the spells that you can cast. In Tunnels and Trolls, you have more robust spell casting on several levels, too. After 5th level, you're expected to not really... you can still cast pre-made spells, and this there are spells in Tunnels and Trolls, for sure. And they go up very high level, which I very much like. But the thing about... this is that after 5th level, you're expected to make your own spells up and on the fly, which I think is really awesome. It also has rules for how to boost spells. So you want to make a spell even more powerful, you can do that, and it's got rules on how to do that. Dungeons and Dragons doesn't. The spells are a lot more locked in, if you like, and you're not expected to make spells except that you go and rent a library and you hire a sage and you do a whole bunch of work that takes your character out of the game for months and months, and then you can create a new spell. Tunnels and Trolls, you can make it up. You can just wing it. It's got rules for that, which I think is really neat. In D&D, turns are 10 minutes with 10-second rounds. In Tunnels and Trolls, turns are 2 minutes, and they happen in 4 phases. So the complexity, there's quite a bit of complexity in Dungeons and Dragons for the DM, in that you have to keep track of the various hit points and so forth. For combats, and if you have a lot of monsters, you have to keep track of everybody's individual hit points and who's doing what damage to who. In Tunnels and Trolls, you don't have that particular problem. You have a different problem instead, in that you can end up needing to roll huge handfuls of 6-sided dice, because remember, it's a dice pool game, and you put all of the attack dice of monsters together and you just fight groups. So both of them have limitations in that way, in my opinion. So the other thing is Dungeons and Dragons. Remember, these came out just a year between each other, right? In Dungeons and Dragons, there are no guns. Tunnels and Trolls, there's a lot of rules about guns. So if you want to include guns, you certainly can. Dungeons and Dragons does not have a lot of equipment. Tunnels and Trolls has a lot more equipment, right? That's just a thing to consider. Now, I believe the Blue Book, the expert rules, increase the items available to you, but I'm not comparing both books, so just these two. Okay, so in D&D you have fighters, thieves, clerics, and wizards, and in Tunnels and Trolls you have warriors, wizards, rogues, warrior wizards, and you also have berserkers. So that's another thing. So the races, Tunnels and Trolls kind of lets you play any race that you want. Dungeons and Dragons does too, but they don't have rules for it. Like this has a little bit more explanation of how to do that. Dungeons and Dragons, you'd have to wing it a little more. But both systems are very easy to modify anyway, so I don't know how big of a difference that is. Now, Dungeons and Dragons uses race. Tunnels and Trolls uses kindred. Now, Dungeons and Dragons also has race as class. So if you're an elf, you're an elf. In Tunnels and Trolls, it's not like that at all. You're an elf, and you can choose to be a warrior or a wizard or a rogue or whatever. And Tunnels and Trolls also uses a single advancement table, whereas Dungeons and Dragons has different advancement tables according to what class you are or what race you are. And Tunnels and Trolls doesn't do that. It just has the one. Dungeons and Dragons focuses a lot more on gaining gold and killing. You get experience points for gold and murdering monsters, whereas in Tunnels and Trolls you do get experience points for murdering monsters, but you also and they don't call it experience, they call it adventuring points. And there's a whole section, 2-page section, about awarding experience points for daring and for making saving throws, casting spells, and just generally being a good role player. I really like that. Of course, people do that for Dungeons and Dragons as well, but this has a nice big section dedicated to it. There are level limits in Dungeons and Dragons, no level limits in Tunnels and Trolls. I kind of like that. I've never understood the purpose of level limits. I kind of sound like I'm swaying over to Tunnels and Trolls, but I'm really not. It's just that Tunnels and Trolls has a lot of really neat features that I like about it, but I love this game too. But I've never understood the level limits that much. Luckily, Tunnels and Trolls doesn't even bother with them. Both books come with a sample adventure, and but where Dungeons and Dragons really excels is in their random monster tables and in their treasure tables. They don't really... Tunnels and Trolls doesn't really do that. They don't really create a lot of magic items. In fact, their section on magic items says that the GM should create their own magic items. So it just basically goes into what the magic items are made of and so forth, as opposed to Dungeons and Dragons has actual magic items and examples of magic items. And I think that that's a better idea, because if you're a new player, if you're new to role-playing games and you were to try and pick this up and play it, that would be really confusing. I mean, what? Well, what is a magic item? What does it look like? How does it... Whereas this gives you an idea. And I mean, nobody would ever not make magic items for this, right? So I like the idea. I love where they're going with that DIY feeling for it. It's absolutely fantastic. I get it. I just think they should have had some magic items in there anyway, at least to help out new players. So I'm sure I've missed a ton of stuff, but this is just a quick look. I'm already at 20 minutes, so that's good enough. Please leave a like and a thumbs up, and let me know who won. Which game do you think is better? Is there a better? Are they just completely different animals? I have no idea. Let me know. I'd love to hear what you think. All right, thank you, and thanks for watching.